you if you think you can handle that.
I don't know about that.
Thank you, kind sir. See, you took care of our side first.
Well, the sheep deserve it, don't they? Never figured out how it can get so cold and you can still have allergies. I thought allergies were supposed to disappear when it froze. Okay, the topic that we have been looking at, I really haven't spent a whole lot of time tying each lesson to the topic, so I thought I probably need to go back and do that just a little bit this morning. How to confront error, correct hateful opponents, and preach the gospel. That's how I have looked at the message of Galatians. And as we're going to see this morning, but we have already seen in chapter 1, Paul teaches us that sometimes we have to be pretty direct. Sometimes we have to be pretty blunt. Even if it sounds initially to be harsh, I would say this is related to the level of the topic. What needs to be corrected? If it's not something that is critical, then you can certainly be more gentle. What we talk about beating around the bush, being more generic. However, as the topic becomes more and more and more and more important, sometimes our bluntness level has to rise. And with Paul writing this letter to the Galatian disciples, he recognizes that if they continue down the road that it appears that they're going, they could lose their salvation. That this is a salvation issue. This is not an opinion issue. Sometimes referred to, we might say, what is it, Romans 13 or 14? I get those confused sometimes. No, Romans 14. Not a matter of opinion, something that can be one way or the other. What he feels like his opponents are teaching, and at least in his mind initially, that the Galatian Christians have kind of begun to follow his opponents, is that it will eventually it will strip them from their salvation. They will lose their salvation. So we've already seen that in chapter 1. We're also going to come up against this here in the first 20 verses of chapter 4. So not always exactly that somebody has to respond in exactly the same way, but at least here we see this very direct response. Okay, so in chapter 4, I hope you had a chance to read at least the first 20 verses. There's a pretty clear change between verse 20 and verse 21. But I hope we can get through these, what I have identified, these 3 different paragraphs here. The first paragraph, Paul is going to talk about the disciples' inheritance, first 7 verses, and then verses 8 through 11. Paul talks about the disciples' apparent relapse and kind of raises the question whether it's strictly Jewish or perhaps there is a little bit of pagan relapse as well. That not everybody he's talking to is falling back into Judaism, but there might be some pagan issues going on here. And then the last paragraph, a little bit more lengthy paragraph, Paul talks about, compares his behavior to that of his opponents. So if I could have somebody read verses 1 through 7, we want to point out some things here I think are very interesting in these first 7 verses.
Now I say,
As long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So we too, when we were children, were held in bondage under the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, so that he might receive the adoption as sons and daughters. Because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God.
Okay. As I read this paragraph over and over and over and over, and trying to, in some way, outline it, there were some things that I felt like were relatively clear, and there were some things that I thought, wait a minute, is Paul, because he is so emotional at this time, does he lose his train of thought? And does he get sidetracked here a little bit? And so I just started writing down words that seemed to me were repeated. And then I saw something that I hadn't seen before. And so I hope that this outline here on your sheet of paper makes a little bit of sense. Because Paul is writing with such fervor, such emotion, I don't know that this is a perfect chiasm, but certainly verse 1 and verse 7 lead me to believe that because his Jewish mind, because his rabbinic mind thinks this way so consistently, that this might be an imperfect chiasm, but it certainly sets verse 1 and verse 7 to indicate that that is one complete thought, that there's one complete paragraph here. Notice in verse 1, he stresses the word heir and slave. I mean that, well, now, Paul did not create the chapter break in chapter 4, verse 1. Right? So we have to go back to chapter 3 and understand that he's continuing his thought from chapter 3. In verse 23, he says, if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. So this idea of being an heir is on his mind. And so in this next paragraph, he wants to discuss what being an heir really means, and in particular, being an heir according to Christ. So he compares, or contrasts, I guess I should say, an heir with a slave. And actually, Brad talked about this last week. Brought up the idea that what is the difference between an heir and a slave? According to Paul.
Future hope.
Is an heir different?
Not as a child,
Not as a child.
but once coming of age, very different.
So the answer is yes and no. An heir, there's no difference from what they are able to do if they're a child. Daddy can walk you out to his 62 Ford Mustang. Beautiful, beautiful vehicle. Well, let's say 67, 68, 69. I'm not even sure the Mustang was built in 62. I barely was built in 62. But anyway, And so dad can walk you out when you're 8, 9, 10 years old and say, son, when you get your driver's license, this Mustang will be yours, or this pickup, or whatever. Woohoo! That's my truck. Can you drive it? Nope. Are you responsible for it? Nope. Is it yours? Technically, yes. Because your father has willed it to you, has decreed that that vehicle is yours. All right? You are the heir of that particular vehicle. So, in Paul's day and age, if you were a child, no matter what relationship to the rest of the world, you were no better than that slave. Because, he goes on to say in verse 2, that heir, that child, had to have guardians and managers. All right? Those are the words that the ESV uses. Are there any other different words used there in verse 2?
The NASB has a footnote that says, or stewards.
Okay. What would be the difference between a guardian and a manager? Slight.
A guardian looks over you, a manager just kind of manages. For lack of better terms.
Yeah. A guardian is going to protect, lead, guide. A manager says, well, you've got this amount of money. Let's invest it here. Let's make more money. Let's don't throw your breakfast to the dogs. So a manager really probably doesn't have your absolute total best interest in mind, except that he's connected to you and he's not going to get any money if something bad happens to you. So he wants good things to happen for you. But a guardian is going to follow you around and guide you and lead you and protect you. And, if he takes the training wheels off your bicycle, he's going to run along beside you and make sure that you don't fall down, skin your knee. So there is a slight difference, but there are two different roles. A guardian protects, a manager manages. So we were under, or the child is under guardians and managers until the time, and I put time in quotation marks there because here's another word that Paul is going to come back to, at least in concept, if not the exact word, until the time set by the Father. Now, in verse 3, he goes on to identify that we, when we were children, enslaved to the elementary principles. Now, I have a footnote there that says elemental spirits. Any other different translations of that? Elemental principles or elementary spirits?
Basic principles.
Basic principles.
Again, from the NASB footnotes, rudimentary teachings.
Yeah. What I found interesting in chasing this down, it's kind of a reference to the ABCs. The elementary principles are the ABCs. So we were we were enslaved by the ABCs, the very basics of the world. Now, who are the we? Is this a generic we? Is this Jew and Gentile? Is it Jew? What do you think?
It's hard to say since we were all children at one time.
I think it's everyone.
Yeah, I think he's being intentionally ambiguous here. We. And so we, Jew and Gentile, I think both, everybody are enslaved by the elementary principles of the world, the ABCs. But, verse 4, in the fullness of what? Time. Okay? So he's already introduced this idea that you're a child until your father says you're not a child. And then you inherit whatever it is that you're supposed to inherit. You become an adult. And so verse 4, Paul says, in the fullness of time, God sent his son, but not just any kind of a son, born of a woman. Why is that important?
Means he was human.
His humanity, his earthiness. He was one of us. Born what? Under the law. Okay? But that is not what is important about this son. What did this son come to do? Okay. To redeem. Is any other translation there other than redeem? In verse 5, to redeem those who were under the law. That is an interesting word. Redemption has a business kind of context to it. You redeem something. Anybody grow up using green stamps? Green stamps were the most wonderful thing because every time you went to the grocery store, they would give you this wad of green stamps, and you would either lick them or use a sponge and stick them in these little books, and your fingers would turn really cool shades of green. It was awesome when you were a little kid. But you would take them to a
Green stamp store.
redemption center. A redemption center. So you would take your green stamps, you would give the green stamps to the redemption center, and you would walk out with a Coleman stove. That's where we got all of our camping stuff as the Smith family. We could not have gone camping had it not been for green stamps. But it would. So a redemption is when you give something in order to get something, to set, and in this context, to set something free. All right? To redeem those under the law so that we might receive adoption. Now, what is interesting about the word adoption?
Take on something that's not yours.
Okay. What's fascinating is that, or at least to me, might not be interesting to you at all. Adoption is not a Jewish concept. I mean, in the Jewish world, let's say a child became orphaned. They really weren't adopted because they were already part of an extended family. Aunts, uncles would take them over, grandparents would take them over, brothers, sisters would take them over. So there was not a concept really of adoption as such, because if you were born into the Jewish family, your family was generations deep and community wide. Adoption is a Roman concept. Dad doesn't want the baby. They take the baby out and they put him on a rock, or her on a rock. If somebody wants that baby, they can adopt the baby, take the baby, or if the baby is unwanted, the baby dies. But this is primarily a Roman concept. And so it's fascinating that Paul pulls this in and I think it's for a very clear reason. If salvation is only from the Jews, how can you be saved? You've got to trace your lineage back to Abraham somehow. All right? Or you can be on the fringe. You can kind of be on the edge if you're what? What's the word? A proselyte. Okay? So you can renounce your Gentile heritage. You can want to become a Jew, although you're never really a Jew. You're always a proselyte. Someone who came to the Jewish. And so for Paul to specifically use the word adoption and to include the word sons here is profound. We become sons of God, not because we've done anything that ties us back to Abraham, but because of Jesus Christ. And so verse 6, therefore he has put the spirit of his son, which I think is a contrast to the elemental principles. See, the elemental principles keep us in line. It's the ABCs that keep all of our little ducks are in a row. But now once we become sons, once we become adults, because God has adopted us as his sons, now the spirit of his son is in us. We could do, in other words, we can drive that Mustang. We get to do what God promised us that we could do. And the spirit of his son cries out, Abba, Father. Abba, the term of endearment, the closest way that we could reach out to our paternal parent. Interesting, those of you who watch The Chosen, what's the word for the mother? You remember it? Ima. Ima. So Abba, Ima. You learn all kinds of really cool stuff. So, verse 7, we are no longer a slave, but now we are an heir. So it goes back to verse 1. It may not be, I may be seeing something because I want to see it, but to me that helps me understand this paragraph. And if I'm right, big if, then really Paul's key point that he's trying to make here is that the time has come. We are no longer children. The fullness of time has come. God has sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, for the purpose of redeeming us, giving us the adoption, so that we are no longer slaves, but an heir. Any thoughts or questions or comments about that particular paragraph? All right, this next little paragraph we'll try to get through very quickly because the last one is rather lengthy. He's really coming back to the idea that I don't understand why you Galatian Christians seem to be so confused, so messed up. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature were not gods. But now you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God. How can you turn your back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world? Why are you going back to the ABCs? If you can do calculus, why are you spending so much time with 2 plus 2? All right? God has set you free. Why are you going back? You observe days, let's see, whose slaves you want to be once more. You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid that I may have labored over you in vain. So part of that appears to be kind of a relapse to Judaism, but there's also some pagan ideas here, wanting to return to the elementary principles of the world, observing days and months and seasons and years. Now, in Romans, Paul says if you want to observe a particular day, don't worry about it. It's between you and God. But here, the observance of these seasons and days and months and years indicates that they're not just saying, I want to observe the Sabbath, but maybe there's more going on. That their observing of these days is more of a worshiping, that they have laid aside their devotion to Christ, and they're going back. So there could be some pagan issues here. There are certainly Jewish considerations, and Paul's saying, look, the law was just to get us to Christ. Now that Christ is here, it's not like we're just trashing the law, but we don't depend on the law. It was our guardian, but now we have Christ. We don't need the guardian anymore, the protector anymore. Any thoughts or questions about that little paragraph? Okay, this next paragraph is a little bit lengthy. I'm going to go ahead and read it in the ESV, and I'm virtually certain there's going to be some different translations of words that we want to look at. 12 down through 20. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you, my little children, for whom I am again in anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. Now, I had to go back and read this in a number of different passages because I will be honest, I love the ESV. It right now tends to be among my favorites, if not my favorite, but they don't do a very good job with this paragraph. So just some bullet points there. Apparently Paul had experienced some kind of medical problem when he was in Galatia, or maybe that caused him to stop in the region of Galatia and preach. And the disciples apparently responded with much love and sacrifice, even to the point Paul says, you know, you would have given me your eyeballs, which a lot of people think that Paul had a really bad eyesight and that was his physical problem. He doesn't say that. I think that was just a really radical, you don't transplant eyeballs. And so I think that was just a really radical way of Paul saying, you would have given me anything. We would say, you would have given me the shirt off your back. Now, however, they had turned on him and they were rejecting him. More importantly, I think for Paul, they were rejecting his teaching. Paul is perplexed about their rejection, not only of him, but primarily of the gospel. And this is where I go back to the New American Standard. I believe it's the New American Standard. Brad, the New American Standard there has the word zealous. I think that's really, I think the ESV was trying to smooth over what does zealous mean. The ESV uses the word, they make much of you. And I had no idea what that meant. And so sometimes our English translations, in an effort to help us, don't necessarily accomplish their goal. But as I understand this paragraph, what Paul is saying is, my opponents are zealous for you in order that you might be zealous for them, but I am zealous for you for the right reason. And Brad, you had a comment there?
I was going to say that he's in the NASB 2020, so they look at it, they eagerly seek you, not in a commendable way.
Right. So they're seeking you, they're zealous for you, they are reaching out to you, they want you to think that you're important to them. For what purpose, Paul says? Not literally, but he's he's framing the question. So that you will be dependent on them. Right?
They shut you out, so you have to see.
Yeah. So if I shut the door, if I make it sound really, 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 really wonderful that you want to be a part of my club, but then I shut the door, then you've got to knock on the door. And if I let you into my club, then you're dependent on me. And your very existence in my club is because I'm such a warm, loving, gentle, kind person. And so they make much of you, or they're zealous for you, or they seek you out for the purpose of making you seek them. It's a twisted relationship. A word just went floating. Carnivorous. They're trying to devour you, in other words. Predatory. Thank you, Brett. That wasn't the word I'm looking for, but actually that word is better. It's very predatory. They want you to become their prey because that makes them look better. I have here on the outline that they are zealous for the Galatian disciples, but only to increase their tribe, for tribal reasons. Paul, however, is zealous for them, okay? He says, it is always good to be made much of for a good purpose. In other words, the purpose for which Paul is zealous. And that is for the gospel, for their salvation. Paul is not so necessarily concerned that they follow Paul, which he really makes a big deal of in the early chapters of 1 Corinthians. What he wants them to follow is Christ. And if they give up on Christ and go back to the elemental principles, they may be a part of the opponents. And the opponents may say, see how our congregation is growing? And Paul's point is, well, they just want you to be a part of their tribe, to be a part of their group. I want you to be a part of Christ's group. Any thoughts, questions, comments, objections, rotten tomatoes? This is stuff that I see in the text. Y'all may see something much different and perhaps even much better. Thoughts? So, getting back to my question, how do we confront error? Sometimes, not always, but if the level of the issue is big enough, sometimes we have to say, I don't know why you're doing this. I'm challenging you. I'm confronting you. Because the stakes are just too high. And if you keep going the direction you're going, you can actually lose your heirship. You can actually lose your sonship or daughtership. Ladies, please. Particularly the ESV tends to use masculine pronouns when masculine and feminine are both included. So when he talks about being a son, he's also talking about being a daughter of God. Any final thoughts or questions? Observations? All right. I will assume that A, I did a splendiferous job, or B, I got everybody so confused that you don't know what to think.
Yes.
For next week, finish the rest of the chapter because we get this wonderful, beautiful, confusing, what in the world is Paul talking about? Discussion of Hagar and Sarah. And how does this make any sense whatsoever? So that's going to be fun. And we're going to take a trip down Jewish argumentation, rabbinic argumentation. All right, let's take a break as we get ready for our worship services.